most companies, it's like, well, we're going to do a bunch of work. We're going to sell what we can sell. We're going to build what we can build, and we'll see what comes out when we're done. Well, to me, I want the destination to be where we're going to be financially, the net profit in 5 years. Now let's figure out what we have to do to make that happen.
Hey, Doug, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Spencer.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in. I feel like what we're talking about is very timely, this time of year. But honestly, it's kind of timely for whatever stage of your business you're at. So we'll get into it. But before we kind of get into the weeds, what's your background? How did you get into this crazy world of construction?
Yeah, so I went to business school, came out, was going to pursue a corporate kind of career. And then corporate, and I decided that I wasn't designed for corporate. Just wasn't to my liking. I'd always been around small business. My dad owned a small business landscaping company growing up, and so I just had a lot more familiarity there. I went to work for a small business accounting and consulting company that had 12 offices around the country. They focused mostly with gas stations, convenience stores, did a lot of work with the major oil companies, training and stuff like that. I kind of worked my way through the company by being willing to move wherever they needed somebody when the kids were young and all. And then I ended up president of the company, and then the owner decided to retire. So I bought 4 of the 12 offices back in the mid 90s, late 90s. And so we had offices in Alabama, Arizona, Virginia, and Maryland. And I grew that company for 17 years, but it really became more of an accounting and tax company. And I was a marketing guy, right? So that was like, it was fun to buy the company, but by the time I was going into my 17th tax season and data security and all that, I'm like, you know what? I love the numbers. I love the businesses. There's got to be a better way. And so I sold off the last of the offices. We had started a consulting company right after the recession to try to just kind of help companies get back on track. Did that for a couple of years, and then actually crossed paths with the Remodelers Advantage through LinkedIn. They were looking for someone to do some consulting, but they also hired me to do their strategic planning for 2017. And as they like to say, I just refused to leave after that. So I started working with some of their clients, and I came on board in November of 17 to build the consulting practice under the RA umbrella. So we're just about finished up the 4th year of doing that. So.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. And when you talk about like strategic planning, I feel like I hear that term and probably everybody thinks about it a little bit differently, or to some people it maybe sounds cool because it's like, oh, this is really going to help us get to where we want to go. And to other people it may be like, that's just kind of a fluffy term like strategy. And so how do you think about that? What is strategic planning?
Yeah, no, it's I think you described both ends of the spectrum really well. To me, it's about taking a finite point in time, and I usually like about 5 years. I think shorter than that, it's really hard to make enough change to really see the impact. Longer than that, things get a little bit fuzzy. But to me, it's about, I always start with folks and say, tell me if it's 5 years from today, what's the company look like? What are you doing? What are you making? What are you driving? How many weeks vacation did you take last year? Like, let's really paint a picture of what that looks like, and then start to work backwards from what that needs to be in terms of development of the company. When we had the accounting company right before we sold it, year before we sold it, we did a sort of an analysis of all the businesses we had, and what made them grow, what kept them from growing. And at the simplest level, it was always either the limitation of time, people, or money, or some combination of the two. And so when we work backwards, it's like, well, we've got to hire this many people. I want to make this much money. We've got to accommodate growth. And when you work backwards from where you want to be, it's a lot easier to say, okay, well, we're going to need these things. We'll figure out the when and when the right timing and money and all that is. But it's really hard to go from where you are without a plan and just do more of what you're doing and hope that it's going to bring you somewhere else. Because usually the difference, say, between a $2 million company and a $5 million company isn't just twice as many people or 2.5 as many people working that hard. It's you're doing some things differently. And so, at some point you go from 2 project managers to 3 to but you don't go to 7 usually. You end up with a production manager and a hierarchy. But unless you really kind of paint that picture, it's hard to know when you're at that point, when you're in that moment. And I think one of the things that we saw with COVID was, a lot of people have said to me in the last year, how can you do strategic planning when the world turns that's upside down every 6 months, right? But what we found was the people that had that strategic plan before were the first ones to know how far off track they were, what were some of the things they needed to do to bring things back to center. So we try to get, I always tell people, when we start working with them, we're going to be philosophical for a meeting or two, and then we're going to get right down to the nuts and bolts, because you're right, the fluffy stuff is interesting, but it doesn't help you start making those decisions. So I always equate it much more to like a GPS. Like once we figure out where we're going, we're going to figure out a roadmap, figure out how to know where we are, and then mostly figure out when we're off track, right? And then we'll work from there. So
yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. You gotta know where you're going, and then it's a lot of reverse engineering and figuring out what that could look like. But then to your point, like, okay, what's the first few moves right in front of us, because it's going to change along the way regardless, as you get going. I always think it's interesting to use that example of last year. People said, well, how can you do strategic planning in a pandemic? Or you could name anything, right? The stock market crashes, or it's winter, so we're slower. There's always going to be like some, the magnitude will change. But I felt like I noticed that too, where people that had a plan, they were quicker to pivot, quicker to just jump into action on something, because they want to stay on course, versus if you didn't, you kind of went into defense mode. And so do you feel like having a strategic plan, like, is it more about playing offense to get there, or what's kind of the mindset, do you feel like, behind like developing the plan but then executing on it?
Yeah, I think, it's funny because sometimes I think people think of like a plan or a budget as sort of a target, something that's interesting, right? But it really doesn't affect their day-to-day operation. For others, they realize that once that it is just a target until you adopt it. But then once you start making other decisions, like people to hire, a new office location, branding, those kinds of things, once you're making operational decisions based on that target, now you got to hit the target, right? And so it's not just, so I always give like lots of analogies, right? But I always say, I've had a couple of daughters, get married, and when you pick a wedding date, right, it's way out in the future. So whether it's this week or the next week, a year in advance or 2 years in advance, it doesn't make that much difference. But try changing that date when you're 3 weeks out, right? It's impossible. Well, a lot of times in business, what we do is, well, I want to do 5 million. It was, kind of just a random number. And it is random until we started doing the things that it would take to have that infrastructure, the number of leads, all those things. Now it's not inconsequential anymore. Now that number means something that we got to deliver on. And I think that's always the hardest transition for people to come up with. That's why we love the 5-year plans, right? Because it's like, well, if you know where you're going to be, or you need to be in 5 years, or what you're shooting for, then it's a lot easier to say, well, this is what I need 2022 to look like if I'm going to have any shot of being even close to to that target.
Yeah, man, I love that. The target, once you start making the decisions, probably a lot of them are monetary, whether it's personnel or investment in infrastructure, whatever it is. But then you've got skin in the game, which I think is your point, and it's like, you kind of have to make it happen.
Right. Well, you must see that in your own business, right? I mean, when people come to you and it's like, well, what would be nice? What would be good? But then when they start making the investment of time and money and things like that, it's like, well, now it's not just that would be interesting. It's like, no, that needs to happen. Right. Yep. So,
yeah, that's great. I'm curious, what percentage of companies do you think actually do strategic planning? Kind of like hey, this is our 5-year plan. I know you talk to a lot of folks and help people with this, but what's your sense of it? Do most companies do it? Do not that many? Is it half?
It's funny. We probably see a skewed part of the population because they're already sort of in a planning mode. If they're talking to us, if we're working with them in some respects, but amongst the folks we see, I would say probably 2/3 do a good annual budget, and maybe a third of those, do, or a third of the companies have a broader, a multi-year plan. It's growing. I think more and more people are getting that recognition, but I'd say it's probably still maybe 10, 15% of the people really say, here's my 5-year numbers. And, to me, the plan isn't just a revenue number or a target. It's got to be that. It's got to be sort of the model, the business model to go with it. And most importantly, it's got to be the org chart that supports that level of work. Until you get that org chart and the projections to line up with each other, you have pieces of a plan, but you don't have a plan.
Yep. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I'm curious too. I know you talk to people about it and you said it's not just the revenue, but I feel like that's where people start.
Yeah.
Where do you encourage them to go after that? Because you and I both know that that's not the magic answer.
No, actually, the funny thing is I actually flipped the whole thing upside down. I'm like, tell me what you need to make. Tell me what needs to come out the other end when you are of the P&L, when you get to that point. And then how much money do we want to have in reserve? Are we trying to pay down debt? Are you trying to build a building? Like, what does this thing have to do? And I always tell them it's kind of like building a hurdle, right? It's like, this is what the company needs to do. We're going to pay back some debt. You're going to take some money out. To have that level of profit, we know there are going to be some tax implications, right? And then we've got overhead. Well, by the time we build all those up, it tells us what gross profit we need. Now,
Yep.
whether, so if it's $2 million of gross profit, some people will do that with 10 million in sales at 20%. Some people will do it with 4 million in sales at 50%. But it's really building up to that number, knowing what that hurdle is you have to get over, I think is best done from the ground up based on where you want to be, because then it ties everything you're doing in the business to what's driving you personally. And that's what's really going to make it come to life, I think. And then, people need to put the right amount of pressure on their business. If this, and you don't want to be unrealistic and you don't want to be, a bad boss or anything like that. But it's like, most companies, it's like, well, we're going to do a bunch of work. We're going to sell what we can sell. We're going to build what we can build, and we'll see what comes out when we're done. Well, to me, I want the destination to be where we're going to be financially, the net profit in 5 years. Now let's figure out what we have to do to make that happen. And what it tends to do is it helps you keep a healthy pressure on the company to say, if we came out of 2022 a little behind where we needed to be, we got to step it up in 2023.
Yep.
But what we don't want is and so, again, another analogy I always give is like if we were on a 5-day road trip and I had to get to my daughter's wedding, right? When you have 6 daughters, someone's always getting married, right? So, and it's like, hey, if I got to be in California at 2:00 on Saturday and I come out of day 1, I haven't gone far enough. Well, on day 2, I'm going to make some adjustment. I'm going to leave earlier, drive a little faster, take a different route, whatever. And if by day 4, I'm nowhere near California, I'm going to make a bigger strategic change. I'm going to park the car. I'm going to catch a flight, right? But the destination and the timing shouldn't be the variable, and it isn't in that case. But in business, sometimes we make that the variable. We'll just drive and head in the right direction and do things that make sense and see where we end up. And I'm like, no, you tell me what you want this to look like and when you want it, then I'll tell you whether we're driving fast, driving slow on a plane, whatever. But that should be what determines where we're going to put our investment in the company, who we're going to hire, how fast we're going to grow, and of course you always have to adjust for conditions just like you do on a road trip. But again, you adjust, you don't just say, well, it's raining, so we're not getting there, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Great analogy. It feels like a big part of this is kind of the mentality and shifting it from this is an ideal to like, no, I got to get there, and then if you kind of can shift to that, then it shifts your activity. And I think that you kind of walked us through that with, hey, if you're behind, how do you get ahead? And maybe it's doubling your effort the next year, or you have to change the tactic that you were using because that was the wrong one, or whatever it is. But I think you're right. It's interesting to hear that. But as you say it makes a lot of sense. I think we probably all do that with, like, oh, I was trying to lose 5 pounds. Like, well, I lost 4. So I'll lose the 5th one in the next 2 weeks or the next month, or, you adjust the finish line to make yourself feel a little bit better.
And sadly, when I lose 4 out of 5, I celebrate by having a Twinkie and I'm back to 2. So it's
there
like,
you go. Yeah. So what I wanted to talk about next is, I know you said you bought, a business, you sold a business, and in this industry, I feel like we don't necessarily see a lot of that. You do see some of it.
Yeah.
Before we get into the how part, like how do you build the business so that you could sell it, I'm curious, is that something that you, when you're walking people through strategic plans, do they want to sell their business, or is it they want to just retire and close it down? Do they want to hand it off to some, like, I'm curious what you hear, like what do people actually want?
Right. It's a great question. I literally had a call today from someone that heard me speak somewhere, and he said, I really, really want to sell my business in the next 5 to 6 years, but I have a bunch of people telling me that you just don't do that in this industry. So what do you think? And I said, well, it depends on the business, but no, I definitely think there's a sellability to these businesses. I was a little surprised when I first started with Remodelers Advantage, just in talking to a lot of remodelers, because when I had my business, it was a lot of different kinds of companies across lots of industries. Very few that just said, well, I'm going to do my last project and close up shop, unless it was very custom. Um, and I realize there's a finiteness to the projects that we have, but it's really about the expectation of ongoing revenue, right? And so
Mhm.
if you have a business that has been a business for 15 years, that has a reputation, it has trade partners, it has employees, maybe has a physical location, even though those projects are going to come to an end, there's every reason to expect that there ought to be a flow of projects that come behind that, even though they're not under contract, right? And as I told the gentleman I talked to earlier today, I said, if you bought the pizza shop up the street from from the current owner, right? No one in your community is under contract to come buy a pizza from you, right? But it's the flow of business that you're expecting to buy. And in some respects, when I sold my accounting practice, I really sold 8 outdated computers and a mailing list, right? There's not much to it, right? And we didn't even put our clients under contract. We just had great relationships with them. But the fact was, there was a flow there. So I think there is, but I think there's a handful of things you have to do. One is you have to believe that. You have to recognize that. And people will say to me like, well, I could never sell it because it's named after me. And I say, well, H&R Block was a guy, right? Sears and Roebuck, those were people, right? So you can have a business that's named after somebody that's long since dead, and it's all about what the business can produce, right? The reputation it has. So I think it's out there, but I think it's a new avenue of thinking for a lot of folks to really start saying, okay, well then I have to have processes. I can't be in every block on the org chart. I have to, do those kinds of things that are going to give it value, so that when I step away from it, someone says, yeah, there would still be a revenue flow.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, kind of a fun question. If somebody came to you and said, I need to sell my business within the next 3 months, what are like the minimum viable things that they have to like get in place to actually make that like a quasi reality? You kind of
Yeah.
listed a few things, but I'm curious, like what's at the top of the list for like, if you don't have this, like, no way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it's funny. I was just reading a book, and in there they quoted, and I've heard the quote before, but the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best day to do it is today. So really, if you want to sell, it's really something you want to do with like a 3 to 5 year window. Really be thinking about, because a lot of what's going to drive it is um, usually about 3 years of financial statements. What do they look like, and what's that trend, right?
Mhm.
So there's going to be a multiplier that we're going to apply, which is going to be some of the intangibles of the business, like its reputation, and the depth of its subcontractors and those kinds of things. But that multiplier is going to be applied to what has been the net proceeds out of this company for the last 3 years, right? And so really, what you want is that 3 year window to build something that's going to get you to that right kind of number. And it's funny with averages, because averages can go in different ways, right? So you could have a business that averages net profit of 200,000 a year by being exactly 200 a year, right? And so year 4, you say, well, that's probably going to be in that range. So there's a consistency there. You can also have something that averages 200,000 a year by going 400, 300, 200, right? And at that point, it's like, well, the average is still 200 a year, it's still that, but the bottom line is it's heading in the wrong direction. But it also can be true the other way. So consistency is a big deal. Good, clear, understandable financials are huge, because anybody that's trying to interpret or understand what's going on in that business, if they can't decipher those financials, that's really where the value is going to be determined. And that is the hardest thing. So when someone says like, I'm a mess and I want to sell, that's when we're saying like, okay, that 3 to 5 year window is get the financials right, get the numbers, built up over a period of time, processes, those kinds of things. But I do have people that call and say like, I got to be out by spring. And it's like, well, then let's hope you've done some of those things. And
Yeah.
we just have to, shore them up a little bit.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah, obviously not something you want to have to do in 3 months. It doesn't set you up for the best valuation and exit, but yeah.
Well, and really the best thing that you can do in this business is groom a successor, right?
Yeah.
So for some people, it's the next generation of their family. Sometimes it's their leadership team, but there's a lot of value. And that's really how I came to own the company that I had, right? I mean, I was like 32 years old. I think I had $100 in the bank or something like that. I bought a company for $1.1 million, right? And so it was the best opportunity that I was going to have put in front of me, which is
Yeah.
why I kind of ended up in an industry I didn't expect to. When you have that successor, the value of what you get for the company, their familiarity, ease of transition. So sometimes even when people say, I'd like to sell in 3 to 5 years and I don't have a successor, sometimes we'll actually start looking to recruit maybe like a general manager or someone that could be that successor, because it's still such an easier transaction from within.
Yeah, I agree. I did a series of podcast episodes with my dad and my uncle last year, and we come from 4 generations of builders in our family, and so we talked a lot about that, and just yeah, I think succession or finding somebody and grooming them, I think does give you a higher chance of success. Not that you can't find a buyer and go do it that way, but sometimes it's a more natural transition. And if you have that 3 to 5 year window, you're transferring slowly versus maybe a buyer that maybe wants to come in and you'll be on for a year or whatever it is. So yeah, I think that's.
Well, and the funny thing is it's another great reason to do that 5 year plan, because if I start with somebody and say, Spencer, where do you want to be in 5 years? And you say, not here, that also tells me we have a different conversation we need to be having about transition, right? So.
Yep. No, that makes sense. All right. So I guess one thing I always think about, if somebody's like listening to this and they're going, okay, maybe selling is on the table, or I want to go down that path, or I'm thinking about that. What do you think is like one of the single biggest like roadblocks to stopping that from happening? What should they avoid, or what do they need to conquer?
Yeah, I think one thing is, I think most people, and I think right now we're experiencing this just because of the sheer volume going through the industry right now. Most people just don't take enough time to take a deep breath, slow down a little bit, and really think about what they want, what they're doing, and so like, when I first start working with someone, the first thing that I really encourage them to understand is like, we're going to spend a couple hours a month together, right? I need you to spend a comparable amount of time. Like, I don't care if it's at the lake or, in your car or, in your man cave or she shed or wherever you go, right? But you need to have some time to really think, right? You just can't be putting out fires all day long and then hope that sort of a strategic plan pops out in front of you. And that's hard because and people that know me when I had my company think it's ironic that I give that advice, because it was hard for me to do. Between the volume of kids that I had and the volume of offices I had, time for reflection at the lake was really not something I did
pretty minimal. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But it's really one of those things. And then really getting an understanding, some people do it through podcasts, some people do it through industry events, some do it through, our roundtables program, some do it but really getting an understanding of what's going on out there. What are some possibilities? I have a lot of people that have preordained ideas about their business, the margins they could get, the biggest jobs they could ever sell, how hard it is to hire the right person. And a lot of that is really conclusions they're drawing a little bit in a vacuum, and really saying, okay, well, if there are folks out there that have done it, right? Victoria Downing, the president of our company, she likes to say R&D stands for rip off and duplicate, right? We're all doing the same stuff. Go see somebody that's done this stuff really well and talk to them about how they did it. And the one thing I will say about the remodeling industry has been a real, not a surprise, but really a very positive thing to me has been just how welcoming the environment is, the community. I find that, most of the folks that I've met in this community are, great folks. They're very open. They don't mind sharing ideas and helping people. They're great contributors to their community. It's like, and what a fun group of folks to hang with. And so when people really want to explore what the possibilities are, there's just there are folks out there that will help you down that path. So that's really, I think, the first thing. And the second thing is really just getting clear on what you really want out of it. There's a study that says, we subscribe to the Value Builder program, and we get certified in that and take people through, like, when they want to build value in their company. And there's a study that says that, after the sale of a business, like 2 to 3 years after the sale of a business, if people left the business for something they wanted to do, time with the grandkids, travel, write a book, whatever, right? They're like 4 times happier, or 4 times as likely to be happy with the sale than the person that left because they just thought, either it was their time because of health reasons or the economy, or it was time to let the next generation. And they call it, like, push and pull. And it's like, if you kind of feel pushed out of the business, you're much less likely to be happy with that decision than if you're pulled to do something else, right? So a big part of it, I'll say to folks, is, okay, you sold the business today. And you spent that month doing the stuff that around the house you haven't done. You bought a new car, what with the proceeds, whatever. Okay, now what are we doing? And if they're giving me like a blank stare, it's like, okay, we got to figure out where we're headed here, right? If you're
Yep.
going to truly be happy about making that transition. And that's off the charts for a lot of folks. A lot of folks don't, kind of realize how much of their identity is wrapped up in the business. And I went through that myself. It was like, it was great. It was exactly what I wanted. But it took me a good year. I mean, I did some consulting projects, but after 17 years of sort of building and being in it every day, and then it's not there. It's like, well, this is weird. And
Yeah.
I mean, I've got, a lot of times when you're in that situation, you have proceeds from the sale. It's not like you don't have, money to do anything, but it's like, well, what are you going to do? So I think that's a big part of it too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting you talk about that. I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm kind of a huge, like, personal finance investing nerd, if you will. And I've always been on this hard track of, like, financial independence, so that I can take my time to zero and then figure out, like, okay, here's what I want to, like, because it's not like I want to stop working, but, like, here's what I want to do. What I realized, like, I don't have to go from 100 to zero. If I can just set up my business to go from 100 to 50, and then I can use the other 50 to do the stuff that I wanted to do. So I think
Yeah.
what you were saying is really important to think about. Yeah, if you go from 100 to zero, what are you going to fill back the time with? You can only golf so many days a week or go sit on the beach for so long until, if you're an entrepreneur and a business owner, you're going to get bored real quick. So you got to figure
Right.
out something to do. So
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of times in family businesses, you see that too. Like, one generation almost hangs on a little too long, and sometimes the second generation's a little hesitant to jump in. And I've had people say to me, like, look, I don't want to step on dad or mom's toes. Like, I'll take over when they die. And I'm like, yeah, but you get so much going on that week. You got to bury them and everything. It's like, what if we transition earlier and dad got to be your mentor, or mom got to be your mentor, or you got to really build with that level of advice, or they got to pick, what 15 hours a week they'd really like to work on, what 2 projects they'd like to design. Sometimes having that conversation a little earlier on gives everybody a much better playing field. And you're exactly right. I think a lot of times people think about it and it's like, well, I've got to go from 100 to 0. And it's like, nah, there's a lot of numbers in between. You really don't. You
yeah.
know? So
No, that's really good. Well, Doug, we're going to wrap up with our final segment of the show. But before we get to that, if people want to learn more about how you help or strategic planning and that sort of thing, what's the best way to find you online or connect with you?
yeah, they can go to remodelersadvantage.com to the website. They can email me directly at doug@remodelersadvantage.com. And actually, they can get right on my calendar for a 15-minute conversation just by going to www.15minuteswithdoug.com, and it takes them right into my calendar. So
Sweet deal.
love to talk to folks just to get an idea of what's going on in their business.
Yeah, that's awesome. Cool. And if you guys missed those URLs, we'll put them in the show notes for you. But Doug, we always wrap with our fast five. So I'll hit you with 5 rapid fire questions and
Okay.
just say whatever comes to mind and we'll wrap it up. What's your favorite business book and why?
My favorite business book is Good to Great. I just go back to that over and over, and I think it's got a lot of the makings of stuff that really is timeless.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm probably due for a reread on that one. It's been a little while, so good
Yeah.
reminder.
Yeah.
All right, who is the most inspirational person in your life?
Most inspirational person in my life, I'd say now, is my mom. She did a lot of raising us and took us through the tough years. She just turned 80, and she sold our childhood home, bought a condo at the beach, and she was laid off during COVID, and they didn't hire her back. So she used some of the proceeds to buy a competing business, and she opens her new business at 80 years old on January 3rd. So
I love that.
Truly have a strong spirit of entrepreneurship in the family.
Yeah, that's super cool. Awesome. All right, if you could have one superpower, what would that be?
One superpower. I guess I'd fly.
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 Hard to beat that. Yeah.
if for no other reason, not to have to go through the TSA line at the airport.
Oh man, I know. Yeah. All right. Describe yourself in 3 words.
Okay. Energetic, idealistic, and driven.
Very good. All right. Final question. If you could leave our listeners with one piece of advice, what would that be?
Don't be afraid to really design your dream, just like you have customers that design a home, and plan it out and bring it to life. More people are able to do that. They have more control over that than they think, but sometimes they really just don't take the initiative, or they don't believe that they can do it. But just paint the picture you want, make it come to life.
I like it. Yeah, that's great advice. Well, Doug, this has been awesome. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on strategic planning. And yeah, thanks for joining me today.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for having me.